Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, this government's failure to properly oversee and regulate Canada's banking system and its failure to properly manage fiscal policy are the two reasons why Canadian families are struggling with skyrocketing housing prices and why Canadian families are burdened with record high levels of household indebtedness. It's also putting the stability of our financial system at risk. It's mispricing risk and leading to misallocations of capital toward residential real estate. As David Rosenberg has said, Canada's economy is overly reliant on, quote, credit, cannabis, and condos, end quote. The average house price in this country has skyrocketed over the 6 years this government has been in power. According to the Canadian Real Estate Association, the actual benchmark price for a home in this country has gone from $430,000 in November of 2015, when this government was appointed to office, to $762,000 in October of this year, the last month for which we have data. This is a massive increase of 77% over the last 6 years. That's an annual compounded rate of increase of about 10% per annum, far ahead of the nominal growth of GDP. It's putting the cost of housing out of reach for many young families and individuals looking to get a start to their lives. The average house price for a single detached home in Toronto is now $1.8 million. It's $2.9 million in Vancouver. In Fergus and Elora, two small towns in the rural area of my riding of Wellington-Halton Hills, the typical house price has trebled in the last 5 years. It has gone from approximately $325,000 in 2015 to $950,000 in 2020. These prices are way above the long-term average of 3.5 times household income. Prices in many Canadian communities are now 8, 9, 10 times household income. We are an outlier amongst advanced economies of the OECD. In fact, our housing prices are some of the most expensive in the world. As housing prices have skyrocketed, so too has household debt. Mortgage debt makes up the vast majority of household debt. Mortgage debt comprises 2/3 of overall household debt, and the remaining 1/3 of household debt is closely tied to real estate, made up of facilities such as HELOCs and other forms of credit. In 2016, the first full year that this government was in office, household debt stood at $1.9 trillion. Today, it's $2.6 trillion, an increase of almost 40%, an annual compounded rate of increase of almost 6%, far ahead of the nominal rate of increase of our GDP. That amount of household debt is reflected in the fact that household debt as a percentage of household income has also increased since this government has taken office and now stands at 173% today. The government has allowed this to happen. We have a housing crisis in this country, and it's because of this government's failure to properly oversee and regulate the banking system and its failure to properly manage fiscal policy. Madam Speaker, the government has had plenty of warning about this problem. And before I get into who has warned the government about this problem, let me tell you about one of the unintended consequences of these skyrocketing housing prices and skyrocketing levels of household indebtedness. Small to medium-sized enterprises have found it difficult to get financing. Canada has low levels of business investment relative to many of our economic peers. And this low level of business investment is one reason for our low productivity growth rates. This low productivity growth rate is of particular concern because it is the only long-run determinant of wealth and prosperity. And these two challenges, the challenge of skyrocketing household debt and the difficulty many small to medium-sized businesses have in getting financing to make investments in plant, capital, and equipment, are the two sides of the same coin. This government needs to take a hard look at its macroeconomic policies that it has put in place that has made life less affordable for Canadian families, and policies that are making it difficult for businesses to invest and grow and create jobs. The government is ultimately responsible for the regulation of our banking sector through the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions, and it's also responsible for mortgage financing through the Canada Housing and Mortgage Corporation, through tax expenditures, and through government programs, and through Finance Canada. The government has allowed mortgage credit to grow at unsustainable levels. The government's responsibility is to oversee mortgage credit through OSFI and CMHC. The IMF has warned Canada repeatedly over the last number of years about its oversight of housing finance. In addition, the IMF has found through their studies that government intervention in housing finance exacerbates house price swings and amplifies mortgage credit growth in advanced economies in the years before the global financial crisis. Moreover, the IMF studies also concluded that government participation did not provide a cushion against economic crisis, and countries with greater government involvement in mortgage financing experienced deeper house price declines. In a 2011 analysis, the IMF concluded that, quote, rapid mortgage credit growth and strong house price increases go hand in hand, end quote. And they added, quote, government participation in housing finance exacerbated house price swings and amplified mortgage credit growth during the run-up to the recent crisis, particularly in advanced economies, end quote. And they concluded by saying, quote, countries with more government involvement also experienced deeper house price declines, end quote. The officials at Finance Canada and CMHC have warned the government. For example, last year in September, officials at Finance Canada discussed forcing private mortgage insurers to tighten eligibility rules. But they left CMHC to try and manage the risk in mortgage credit markets on their own. Evan Siddle, the CMHC CEO at the time, said, and I quote, we had that conversation, and you'll have to pose the question to the government as to why that didn't happen, end quote. He added in reference to the rejection of the tightening of the rules to reduce risk by adding, and I quote, the Minister of Finance could have done it, end quote. OSFI itself has warned about skyrocketing levels of mortgage credit and mortgage credit growth. But when OSFI proposed higher mortgage stress test levels in 2018, otherwise known as the B20 guidelines, the Minister of Finance opposed the rule. And in March of last year, when OSFI announced changes to capital requirements for Canada's systemically important banks, the government didn't ensure that that additional liquidity, measured in the hundreds of billions of dollars, they didn't ensure that it wouldn't exacerbate the growth in mortgage credit. As a result, household debt, primarily mortgage credit, jumped 4% in the last year, picking up sharply in the middle of last year after March 2020's changes that OSFI had introduced.
The honourable members could have conversations outside the chamber, please, but not here while another member is speaking, please. The honourable member for Wellington Halton Hills.
The Governor of the Bank of Canada, Tiff Macklem, warned earlier this year that Canadian households were taking on too much debt. In other words, the Governor of the Bank was warning the government that it's not using the tools it has at hand to properly regulate mortgage credit growth in this country. Madam Speaker, Canadian families are finding it harder and harder to make ends meet. They're being squeezed by the increasing cost of living, and they're being squeezed by the cost of housing. And Madam Speaker, it's because of this government's failure to properly oversee and regulate Canada's banking sector and its failure to properly manage fiscal policy. Thank you very much.
Questions and